midst of Venezuela's political crisis, the U.S. looks to be taking every step short of military action so far to support the opposition leader. What's really behind this obsessive push? And is the U.S. plotting more moves in the region? And S&P Global got the go-ahead to rate China's domestic bonds, the first foreign-owned company allowed to do so. What does it mean for foreign investors and for China's domestic capital market? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. The crack in Venezuelan politics continue to widen, but President Nicolas Maduro said he's ready to negotiate with the opposition with the help of international mediators. Maduro extended the olive branch during an interview with a Russian news agency a week after Juan Guaido, the chairman of the National Assembly, declared himself interim president on January the 23rd. Over the last week, world powers have started taking sides, with China urging all parties to seek a political resolution to the country's problem through peaceful dialogue, and the U.S. officially backing Guaido's slapping sanctions on Venezuela's state-owned oil company and keeping all options on the table. What's the real intention of the U.S.? To restore so-called democracy, to control resources, or to curb recent inroads, so-called, in the region by Russia, Iran and China, or something else? Joining me in the Beijing studio for discussion are Qinduo, Senior Fellow at the Pangoal Institution, and from Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Let me start with this article by the Wall Street Journal. Just most recently, it says that U.S. push to oust Venezuela's Maduro marks first shot in plan to reshape Latin America. This was the headline of that story, which came out on January the 30th. The report also says the Trump administration's attempt to force out the president of Venezuela marked the opening of a new strategy to exert greater U.S. influence over Latin America, according to administration officials. And also, the United States looks forward to watching each corner of the triangle fall: in Havana, in Caracas, in Managua, the capital of Nicaragua. This was said by John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, in a November speech that unveiled the emerging strategy. He described the three countries as the troika of tyranny, meaning Cuba, Venezuela and Nicaragua. And the troika of tyranny is a phrase that he coined, adding that the troika will crumble. So, Dr. Weitz, let me go to you. Do you see things that way? Why do you think the U.S. feels so threatened by these three countries?
I think that John Bolton's, the views that are attributed to him in terms of this, using the opportunity now to roll back some gains that have been made by other countries in the region, taking advantage of new social media technology and other means to promote democracy and so on. That sounds plausible. I mean, I think it accords with what National Security Advisor Bolton has been saying for years. And in terms of the threat, it's more a challenge in the sense that we've seen a lot of democratic legitimacy crisis rolling back a democracy in other regions, whereas in Latin America we've actually seen more progress in recent years. So you want to continue that trend. There's concern about the large number of refugees, particularly from Venezuela. The economic challenges there are pulling down others. As was mentioned, China and Russia have been making a lot of gains in the region. This might be so all those factors may come into play. I don't know. I mean, each person probably has a different priority in the administration, but those factors are probably all working.
The thing that I don't really understand, and I think many people would ask the same question, why is Cuba? Why Cuba seems to be the #1 enemy for the U.S.? You were talking about progress being made for democracy or so on and so forth. But, you know, Cuba has remained the same system, and actually the Trump administration rolled back the U.S.'s policy with Cuba. Why they're so obsessed with this country? Dr. Weitz.
Well, right. This is not a new development. This has been the case for decades. There was some thinking that after Fidel Castro left the scene, there might be a transition in Cuba. That did not occur. As you mentioned, the Obama administration tried to work on outreach, relax some of the sanctions. The Trump administration put them back in. You know, the U.S. policy towards Cuba, looked at the long term, been pretty constant. I mean, it's true we've seen a change since the Obama period, but that is just because of the proximity of the island, the large number of Cubans in the U.S. It's always been a central concern. The question of Venezuela and Nicaragua, as you know, has gone up and down over the years.
Yeah, well, I can't really be persuaded by your argument on Cuba, but let me welcome my third guest here, joining us from Philadelphia, George Ciccariello-Maher, visiting scholar at the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics and author of We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution, among other books. Mr. Maher, thank you very much for, or George, may I call you, thank you to participate in our show. So what do you think is the U.S.'s new strategy? Are we looking at a new U.S. strategy to contain the influence of countries such as Russia, Iran, or China in Latin America, and that the U.S. is sorting to make crumble the so-called troika of tyranny made up of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua?
Absolutely, on one level. When it comes to what's happening in Venezuela today, for example, there's a great deal of talk about oil, but I also think we need to bear in mind the political stakes of what's going on, because what has happened globally over the last couple of decades is the emergence of what Hugo Chavez would have called a multipolar world, the emergence of Russia, of China alongside the United States, and a sovereign, unified, and autonomous Latin America. And this was incredibly dangerous for U.S. interests, concretely speaking, and certainly for the political symbolism of the United States, the Monroe Doctrine, this idea of dominance over the Western Hemisphere. And this is something that politically Trump wants to reassert, as well as reasserting economic control over the region.
Okay, Mr. Xu here in the studio, what is your take on this opinion that was expressed in the article? And how do you look at the fixation the U.S. has, especially since the Trump administration came in power and John Bolton coming into this place as National Security Advisor? Is it about undoing Obama-era policy? Is it about a Cold War-era legacy? Or is it are there real threats?
Well, you have to choose, I would say, it's more like a Cold War-era legacy. On the first level, you see there's the Monroe Doctrine. There's more talk of Monroe Doctrine since the Trump administration senior officials for several times on several occasions talk about the necessity of Monroe Doctrine. But look, this is the 21st century. I'm not sure that's so completely
Monroe
acceptable.
Doctrine means Latin America belongs to
U.S. backyard, and the U.S. basically is playing a dominant role. As my colleague pointed out, those are independent states. I'm not sure they are happy to accept the U.S. complete domination in this region.
Okay.
On the second level, it's really about the U.S. Remember the national strategy, basically at the end of 2017, which sees Russia and China as a strategic competitor, so-called big power politics coming back. So the U.S. sees somehow the Chinese investment or the Russia's influence in this region as a threat to U.S. So that's the U.S. Obviously logic over there, right or wrong.
Okay. Dr. Weitz, another point here. The U.S. calls its aim to restore democracy the U.S.'s aim is to restore democracy in Venezuela, but let's not forget that Maduro was elected, right, whether for the first term or for the second term. Is it really about democracy?
Well, the sense among the experts and observers was that election really wasn't fair. The most recent election resulted in a victory for the opposition in the parliament, but there were changes that disallowed the parliament's ability to do anything. I mean, we've now seen the Europeans, the American government, and so on, others call for new elections and to make clear who has the mandate. And so far, President Maduro is resisting. But that might be a solution to the crisis. You just hold the new elections, and if he's really as popular as he claims, which does not appear to be the case, but be that may, have free and fair elections, he wins, and that would resolve the crisis in some sense. or if there is a peaceful transition to the opposition.
Yeah.
But that I think is what the solution most people are pushing for now, to find out really who has that mandate, because it's unclear based on what's happened recently.
Okay. Well, the problem I have with such statement is always that they assume democracy is only in the form of a Western liberal democracy. No other country or countries that opt for any other systems must not be democracy. George, what is your take on this issue?
I think with regard to that question, there are a couple of issues. The first is, what kind of bullying and blackmail is acceptable when it comes to forcing a newly inaugurated leader to simply call new elections? And regardless of what we think about it on principle, it looks very bad for Maduro, who was recently elected, recently inaugurated, to then simply bow down to foreign powers that are demanding a new election. But the second is exactly as you mentioned, namely the fact that part of what is so interesting and encouraging about what has happened in Venezuela over the past 20 years, this recent crisis notwithstanding, is the development of really new and interesting direct forms of democracy on the grassroots level. And if you go and ask those people who are participating on the ground level, who are struggling through the crisis every day, many of them want to continue and improve the economic governance of the country. They're very frustrated with the Maduro government, but they certainly aren't willing to hand their country over to really the same old elites that have always governed it previously.
Okay.
And so they're willing to, and they're interested in fighting it out on the ground, coming up with real economic solutions to this crisis.
Right. At this moment on the international media, you don't hear these voices. You only hear that people are angry with the Maduro government and so on and so forth. Qinduo, do you want to add something here?
No,
because China is always considered not a democracy in the Western media too. We have the same problem, let's say.
Right. For this Venezuela crisis, it's really an economic crisis. It has been there for years, or even more than 10 years probably. The lack of basic necessities, daily necessities for people. People are frustrated with that. If you look at even for those so-called the opposition voices, we hear mostly from Western media, but also if you go to the eastern part of the capital, actually that's the supporters of the Maduro government, there's no demonstration, there's no people going out in the streets. So that's not fully reported. So that is still the country, in a sense, you can say divided to say the most.
Yeah. Well, finally, I want to ask this question to George, because you wrote this opinion piece talking about there is a fight between democracy and dictatorship, and that the Guaido appointed the chargé d'affaires for Venezuela in the United States said at a press conference after meeting U.S. Vice President Mike Pence. You wrote that Maduro is no dictator, and the opposition, much less Guaido himself, do not speak for the people, in an opinion piece published in Al Jazeera on January 29th. What is your point here?
I mean, the point is that the opposition, while it certainly has some support in the streets, is speaking as if it represents the whole Venezuelan people. And that's simply not true, as your other guest mentioned. Venezuela is still deeply divided. Even more interesting and underreported is the fact that while Maduro has certainly lost a great deal of popularity in the last couple of years, the opposition has not gained popularity. Some voters swing to the opposition, but they don't identify with the opposition. They often identify as Chavistas, who are frustrated with the situation. And so to go out and speak as if they have a mandate to simply take over power is absurd, and constitutionally speaking, it represents a violation of the constitutional order. I think the difficult question is how to move forward with the fact that really no one knows where the majority comes down. It's possible that new elections would give a victory to the opposition. There's no reason, however, to think that the opposition would stabilize the economy. They haven't offered any kind of policies, any kind of solutions.
Right.
But also Maduro's government has been slightly stubborn when it comes to really addressing the macroeconomic solutions that the Venezuelan population needs at the grassroots level, particularly with regard to the currency. So there's a bit of a standoff and a bit of a difficult situation.
Yeah.
With
Well,
the
to
sanctions,
manage the economy,
things will get much worse for the Venezuelan poor.
To manage the economy is never an easy task for anybody. Well, I'm going to leave it there. Many thanks to my guests, Qinduo, Senior Fellow at the Pangoal Institution, Richard Weitz, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and George Ciccariello-Maher, Visiting Scholar at the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics, and author of We Created Chávez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution, among other books.